Hey everyone, welcome to our amazing webinar. I'm going to give it 1 minute for more folks to join. I'm Toby Anderson. I'm the head of customer experience for SpeakApp, and we have some pretty amazing content and speakers for you today. I would love for you, if you have already joined us, to go ahead in the chat and tell us where you're joining from. I will start us off. Right. I'm giving it 20 more seconds and then we're going to go. I see we have just a few more people joining. All right. Amsterdam. Amazing. All right. Please keep chatting. Let us know where you're joining from. But I'm gonna kick us off. We have a lot of good content to cover today. So really quick, some housekeeping. The chat is here. If you have any questions and so forth, you can put it here in the moment. But if you have questions for our speakers and you don't want to wait, go ahead and pop them in the questions section. And at the end of the webinar piece, we're going to go into Q&A. So we don't want you to have to hold those questions per se. Go ahead and pop them in there, but we'll make sure to cover them. If not live, then definitely we can follow up with any questions you have. And also, we are indeed going to, keep everyone on mute. But if you have questions, we want to hear them. This is a session for you. We have a lot of good content today. So with that said, I'm extremely excited to have Lynn Zimmerman and Alyssa Towns joining us. I actually have been able to meet both of these wonderful women in person and done some work with them. Lynn is the head of Swing Communication. She is an expert in internal and change communication, and is also a board member of IABC Colorado alongside me. So I've had the pleasure of working directly with her. And Alyssa Towns is a freelance writer and an expert in internal communications. She also has her own newsletter called Time Intentional. I highly recommend checking it out. And I'll let them tell you more about themselves, but thank you for joining, ladies. And Lynn, I'll let you go ahead and kick off.
All right. Thank you so much, Toby. We're excited to be here today. Like Toby said, I'm Lynn Zimmerman. I am the CEO of Swing Communication, and I focus on change and internal communication. I'm coming to you today from Pleasanton, California. Normally, I'm based in Fort Collins, Colorado, but I'm traveling this week for some client work, and I'm just really excited to be here and talk about frontline communication. It's one of the topics that I'm really passionate about, and I'm seeing some really cool things being done with frontline communication in our work.
And I'm Alyssa. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm joining from Denver, Colorado this morning. I previously worked in internal communications and have a little bit of background in change management as well. So I take my internal communications and change management knowledge and am transforming that into creating written words. So you'll see me partnering with various internal communications companies like SpeakApp to create written content and really help internal communicators as our discipline never stops evolving. So I'm really excited to share with Lynn today and to bring some new ideas and templates to your work.
All right, let's get started. So we have a full agenda today. We just want to talk about, what is that gap with the frontline? We all know that the frontline is not the same as your corporate employees. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about what is different, what makes them different from our traditional communications that go out to our corporate employees. And so again, we're going to talk about what you need to know about the frontline as you create a communication plan around them. We'll provide you with some frontline framework principles. And then I think the thing that most of you are probably here for, we're going to provide you with a starter kit with some templates so that you can leave today and have something new to try in the work that you do. So we're going to talk about why does frontline communication so often miss the mark? And, you know, we've got a poll that just should pop up here. And so we want to talk about, we want to hear from you. What happens in your organization? And if the responses don't match with your challenges, go ahead and drop them in the chat. But basically, you know, thinking about frontline communications, frontline employees, they're not the same. There's differences between your frontline workers and your corporate workers, and the way they receive information is not the same as your corporate. So you need to, as you're working with frontline employees, if you have them out on the front lines, you are you've really got to think about how do they receive information, who do they trust, what do they need to know in order to make the change that you're asking them to change, or what information do they need. So just some interesting information about frontline employees. 61% of frontline employees say they feel ignored or unheard by leadership. These are people who are doing the work that makes money for your company, and to have that many people say they don't feel heard by leadership, that's concerning. You know, just 24% of frontline workers are confident in their job skills and what's going on and know what's going on within the company. You know, so they're not hearing the messages that the CEO of the company is sharing, and they're not hearing, you know, they're not connecting because they're focused on doing the work. They're focused on other things like safety and, you know, getting the job done. They don't have their phones with them all the time necessarily. So, you know, a McKinsey study shows that companies with effective internal comms programs, they enjoy 4.5% higher, or 4.5 times higher retention rates, 30% higher engagement rates, 12 times higher job satisfaction, and 25% higher productivity. It just shows, information like this shows how important it is to reach your frontline and try different methods and techniques in order to communicate effectively to those employees.
So just to reiterate what Lynn just described, communication is not one size fits all, right? Most of you probably know that, and that's why you're here, to learn a little bit more about Frontline. But just to reiterate some common points around communication, first, we want to know, how confident are you that your frontline employees feel informed and heard? Let us know in the poll. But just to go over a little bit of the high-level differences here, frontline communication strategies ultimately should look and feel different from desk-based workers, because those workers are different. Their environment is different, their circumstances, their schedules, who they are as people, and what they're motivated by. All of those things are different, and our strategies should really be built around how best to support them. You know, when we talk about equity in communications, it doesn't necessarily mean identical. So it's not always about sharing identical pieces of information. It's making sure that we're meeting our frontline workers where they are and providing them equal access and opportunities to act on the same information as their desk-based colleagues. There's a little bit of a common corporate bias that happens as well, right? So our strategies unconsciously align around either people who sit at desks on computers all day, or sometimes around our communications teams as well. So when teams are small and resources are strapped, we might do the things that work best for us and not best for the people we're trying to reach. And that's totally common and natural, right? We have to do the best we can with what resources are available to us, but it certainly can miss the audience that we are trying to connect with. And then one super important note about Frontline I think worth mentioning is that frontline workers often have a lot less margin for error than our desk-based colleagues, because we're talking about greater risks around safety, customer experience, lives quite literally being on the line. So just knowing that there's a little bit less room there for error makes a big difference as well.
All right, so this one we want to talk about, just how the communications are different and how the communication styles when you're communicating with Frontline. And so, a lot of our communications are designed from the center outward. You're communicating from headquarters to on-site. And so, well, that's great. It's where we sit. We have to put ourselves in the receiver's end, how they, what are they working on? How do they work? Are they sitting in front of a computer? How often can they access a computer? How often can they look at their phone? And so when we're sitting at the corporate office or in an office where we're not, around the frontline activity, it's sometimes easy to forget that they might not be able to receive those things in the way that somebody sitting at a computer or somebody who has access to a phone can receive them.
Similarly, a lot of communications practices optimize for distribution, right? So, we love to talk about how many messages we sent or how many times we said the thing and how many different channels did we use, really increasing those distribution numbers, but not necessarily practical use. One quick, kind of measure I like to think about here is, rather than did we send it, we ask the question, could our frontline staff use it in the moment they needed it? So really shifting around, is the information practical rather than just a large quantity?
Sometimes we assume that they have resources that don't exist. So desk access, time to view messages, access to their phones at all times, ability to talk with their managers whenever they want. So we can't make assumptions about who those people are. We actually need to get out. We need to understand who we're communicating with so that the messages receive them in the way that they can acknowledge the information and understand what is happening.
And messages sometimes lack relevance and arrive at the wrong time as it relates to frontline workers, right? So pushing corporate messages that focus on strategy, vision, and big picture business ideas might not resonate with the people who are in a completely different day-to-day line of work. So really making sure that, messages are translating in a way that resonates, as well as arriving too early, too late, or on schedules that just don't really work for them, right? If we decide that we send corporate messages at 4 p.m. local because that works best for headquarters, you could miss people on different shifts. You could be catching people mid-shift, but they actually need the information, now, and they don't have time to access it now. So just really thinking about how different their day-to-day looks and how we can communicate in a way that really resonates with them outside of some of the broader business language.
And the last thing is, often your frontline leaders lack training in communication skills. I think we've all seen frontline workers, often the supervisors are a frontline worker who did a really good job. They were a great team player. And so they were given the opportunity to grow into more of a management role. And they're often hired for their skills as a frontline worker. They're really good at their job, and communication skills are not necessarily their strength. And so just expecting a frontline supervisor or manager to be able to take a message that we share with them and ask them to relay that to their employees is often a big ask. And sometimes they're uncomfortable with it. Sometimes they just don't know what to do with information. They don't know who to go to if they have questions about the announcement. And so it's really important that we provide them with tools that are that help them and help them communicate, help them know what to do, help them know how to ask questions if they need to get more information about the information that we're asking them to communicate. And also, I think a big point in here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that leaders within the company, so the people who sit in the corporate office, we need to be advocating for the training for these frontline leaders to make sure that they are given the skills needed to be successful in their jobs and communicate. It's a win for the company when they have that additional communication training, and it's a win for the employees and the people who want to rise up in the ranks and become more senior leaders. Teaching them how to communicate early in their leadership career will just set them up for success, and everybody wins through that, both the employees and the company. All right, so what do you need to know about frontline workers? What are things that you should be thinking about as you're creating a communication plan to communicate information that will impact your frontline? Things like and so we've got a poll question that just popped up. And so how are your frontline employees receiving important updates today? Share with us what how your company is handling that. And again, if you have something different than what we've included, feel free to share that in the chat. But you have to consider things like the environment. Or is safety a real concern in the environment where they're working? Do they have access to tech, and what does that look like? Do they have individual computers? Does everybody have a laptop, or do they have a phone on their person at all times? Or do they get their updates when they're in the break room and there's a common terminal that they can go look at? What does that technology access look like? Because we have become so dependent on technology. It makes life much easier for communicating with corporate staff, but obviously when you're working with frontline workers, depending on what environment they work in, they may not have easy access to tech all the time, and they might not have company issued tech, and so that adds a whole other level of complexity in how you communicate with them and what tools you use. They have limited cognitive bandwidth. Some of these frontline workers are in extremely dangerous jobs. And so, they're focusing on going home to their family safely. And, they want to make sure that they don't get injured. They don't have something that causes them not to be able to work. And so their focus is on something probably completely different than what somebody who is sitting in a corporate office would be thinking about. And so we have to take that into consideration. And how much information outside of, them doing their job can they handle every day? Safety concerns, we've touched on that. It is a lot of frontline roles have a lot of risk. And so we need to make sure that is top of mind all of the time. We can't bog them down with information that could distract or, take their focus away from being safe and not injuring themselves on the job. Language, from a U.S. perspective, we have a lot of our frontline workers might not have English as their second or as their first language, and so we have to consider what languages do they speak. Is the information we're sending them, if we're communicating in English, are they going to understand it? Do we need to think about translation, things like that? So you need to really know who is doing the work on your front lines. And then work schedule and define breaks. And so, in the corporate world, we often can come and go mostly as we please. We have meetings where we're at our desk, but our schedules are more flexible usually. On the front line, they're working shifts. They have a production schedule that they need to meet. They have metrics that they're trying to hit. And so we need to make sure that we're not causing them to miss a production scheduled, metric by giving them information that is complicated. We want to make sure that they are meeting their goals, and because if they're not missing their goals, the company's probably not making as much money and being as successful. as we know. And then we also want to know, define breaks. When are they going to be in the break room? How often do they have a chance to check the kiosk for information? So just kind of knowing what is their routine is incredibly helpful.
So when we categorize these differences, we're really talking about 4 kind of big picture areas to focus. So we have the who, right? Who are we talking about? Frontline, obviously different from corporate. And even within that, there are different types of frontline workers. So we have different roles, different locations, different languages, as Lynn mentioned. We've got union versus non-union sometimes. We've got contractor versus employee. So really getting to know what those audience groups look like. This is where persona building is really helpful, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But knowing who those people are and what defines those groups is super important. When we talk about what, we're talking about what motivates them. So what do they absolutely need to know? Again, not to distract them from what's important and keeping them safe and making sure that they're getting the job done. What's useful to know, so might be nice to have, but not critical. And then what's nice to know, but totally optional, right? And really making sure that we're focusing on that first category around what they absolutely need to know as our focus. And then designing tiers of information accordingly. So making sure that we're providing access to additional information, but really focusing on the most important pieces and ensuring that that's what's being communicated and getting across. When we look at when, we're looking at when we communicate with them, of course. So what their workday looks like and feels like, maybe anchoring messages to shift rhythms, pre-shift huddles, safety briefings, weekly stand-ups, really just forming our communication around their schedules to make it make sense for them, not for corporate. And then the how. So we talk about different types of information with Frontline, right? When you're at a computer and you have access to an intranet, email, Slack or Teams, a million other different channels, you have constant connection to information. And with Frontline, we can talk about pull information. So, they can pull it themselves on their own time, or push information and, information that we really need to get in front of them that's critical to their safety, their well-being, and what they need to know. So really just thinking about channels a little bit differently there as well to ensure that we're reaching them where it makes sense, and not expecting that they will pull and access information on their own. Lynn touched on this a bit, but frontline staff is the reason the company makes money. So we want to protect their work and we want to protect their time, and making sure that communication isn't bogging them down and distracting from company goals, and making sure that we're thoughtfully curating what we're giving them through these channels. And we also need to keep in mind how frontline workers are evaluated too. So if they, have strict time goals, or they need to achieve a certain number of visits during their shift, or whatever that looks like for their unique situation, we need to keep that in mind so that our messaging doesn't take away from what they are focused on as far as being evaluated and fulfilling their job duties. And then finally, one more thing we love to mention about Frontline that's definitely worth remembering. If you remember anything, it's that we have to leave behind outdated assumptions that frontline workers don't care and that they lack interest in company communications and messaging. They often don't. They generally just need to hear or receive the information differently, right? They care about the company's direction because it affects their job security, their safety, their daily reality. And we can learn more about what they care about by spending time with them, getting to know them, and asking them. We shouldn't just write them off as not caring about the direction of the business and their career paths and the way forward.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I've worked with employees in a mill situation, and I was surprised and, just impressed with how knowledgeable the employees in the mill were about the economic, situation that was happening, because they needed to know that information. They kept a close eye on how things were going, because it was a matter of, if we're not meeting these numbers, if there's an economic situation that's affecting the industry in some way, the mill might shut down, and that affects their ability to support their families. And so they're very interested, and they do pay attention, and they do want to be asked for their opinions. They really do care. It's not, they just don't work in an office. They have as much invested in the company as your corporate employees do who are sitting at a desk.
All right, so Lynn and I put together 5 Frontline framework principles to share with all of you. We're really excited about these big areas to focus, and then, of course, the templates that we'll get to after support these ideas. So first, following up on what Lynn just mentioned, right? Never make assumptions about your frontline employees. If you found today's webinar through any of my LinkedIn posts, you might notice I mentioned psychology a little bit. I think it's super important, right? Psychology is connected to communication, and getting to know frontline employees is the best way to support and communicate with them. So don't make assumptions about what they care about, or what messaging works for them, or what channels work for them. Talk to them. Right? Let's get out there, get to know them. You can go out and ride along with them, observe how communication flows within their own teams, on site, or in whatever structures exist within your organization. You can't communicate with the frontline team well that you haven't experienced. So open those frontline listening loops, do listening tours, shadow, do post-shift debriefs, spend time with different people on different shifts, and just really get out there and use those psychology skills to understand their behaviors and what works and doesn't work for them. Another easy way to do this, when it makes sense, is to involve frontline staff in some of your message testing to learn whether a message may or may not resonate with those groups. So if you have opportunities where you're drafting messaging or working on broader campaigns within your organization, and you can run small pilot groups with frontline workers, pull them in and ask them, does this make sense? What else would you need to do your job? What kind of questions would you have after we share this type of messaging? So don't make assumptions, get out there, get to know them, and work directly with them.
All right. Our next step is, anchor your messaging and how work actually happens. And what we mean that by is, they're working differently. Some frontline workers are working in 3 different shifts. You have overnight employees, you have people working non-traditional hours. And so you really need to think about, how is the work flowing in the organization? When do we need to communicate this information so that it lands when our frontline teams can actually receive the information? Do we need to send the message more than once because we have different shifts, things like that? And so your strategy really needs to be framed around, how does this impact the person receiving it? What task does it impact? Is there a safety concern with communicating this information? And where in their workday do we need to communicate it? Should it be at the beginning of the shift? Should it be during their lunch break? When will it have the most impact and be the most memorable for the employees who are receiving that information?
We should also build strategy around messengers and not channels. This applies to desk-based workers as well, but it's even more important with frontline. Investing in your messengers and where trust already exists. So at the local level, maybe with on-site teams, people that, frontline workers spend most of their time face-to-face with, really building your strategy around those people and those relationships where it already exists can help strengthen and cascade messaging through the organization without relying on, sending the same message across 5 different channels and hoping that employees read and understand it at some point. So build around those people, find out who those people are. They might be informal leaders, they might be on-site managers. It depends on the team setup, but figuring out who those people are and supporting them, and then ensuring that you have the proper channels to back them up is really key there. We'll talk a little bit about manager communications in the template section, because that's one great way to ensure that your messengers are equipped to help share some of your key messaging without bogging down channels. And then Lynn mentioned earlier, just making sure that we're regularly providing training to frontline managers so that we're constantly building up their skills, their communication skills, so that they can effectively support their teams as well, is super important.
So the next one is advocating for your frontline employees and coaching leadership. And we touched on this, that often frontline employees are kind of forgotten. I've worked in organizations where there's been, the conversation with a lot of leaders is, oh, we don't need to tell them. They don't care. They don't know. And so we know that's not true. And so we need to be constantly reminding leaders that we're working with that, how are we going to communicate with the front line? How are they going to react? What do they need to know? And how do we need to communicate that differently with them? And we also need to, coach their leadership in order to help us be successful in communicating with those frontline employees. There's research that shows when you ask frontline employees who their most trusted source of information is, it's almost always going to be somebody within their line, either their immediate supervisor, maybe the plant manager, or the highest level person within within their organization, within their frontline organization. But they rarely will say, I trust the CEO most for information, or that's who I look to for information. It really is coming from somebody who's much closer to them. And that's why it is so important to provide frontline leaders with communication training and tools that help them be successful in communicating. But ultimately, you as a communications professional need to be reminding the leaders you work with about the benefits of providing that communications training to our frontline supervisors and managers, and finding different ways to reach your frontline employees, different tools, perhaps like something like Speak App, or, posters in break rooms and digital screens and things that make it easy for those frontline employees to receive information. So we're the advocate. We should know who they are. Part of our jobs as internal communications professionals is understanding the organization, and that just doesn't mean the people who work around you. It is everybody within the organization, so you can communicate successfully and those folks feel as informed as the person sitting in the cubicle next to you.
And then our fifth one of my favorites, so prioritizing stop, pivot, or replace methods. One thing when we talk about strategy, especially as it relates to communications, is I think strategy can feel very big and overwhelming and long-term. And flexibility in frontline communications it's necessary, it's practical, and it's respectful. So just really, again, learning what works, developing assessment criteria for your organization to determine when it's time to try a different method or to retire a method that's maybe not resonating with frontline workers, and not feeling attached to having to, carry out some 18-month-long strategy that maybe isn't working for your team members. Frontline conditions also change quickly. So just knowing that, our strategies must also be adaptable to meet those changing conditions and really ensure that we're meeting frontline workers and meeting the changing demands.
All right, so this is where the rubber meets the road. How do you put these principles into practice? And Alyssa and I both agree that when we share information, we want you to be able to leave this presentation and actually have something that you can do today. Maybe a new idea, maybe one of the templates, you can try that out. But we want to make sure that when you leave today, you feel like you've learned something new and you can go out and try to use it in practice. So we've put together a toolkit for you, and we will be, the Speak App team will be sending you the toolkit. And so hopefully there will be some things in there that you find useful, because these are things that Alyssa and I use in our day-to-day practices with our clients and with the companies that we've worked with, and have found a lot of success. And so we'll go through those, and then, like I said, you will receive this toolkit. And so you can start using it in your practice. And so the first tool that I wanted to talk about is the stakeholder analysis template. This tool has gotten me in so many doors because it is just a great way to walk leaders, managers, project leads through the communication process, through a thought process that helps them understand, who are we communicating to, and why do we need to communicate with them, and in what ways do we need to communicate with them. And so basically it's a pretty simple tool. You list out your stakeholder groups, and I always say, you don't want to just say employees. You want to get granular. You want to talk about your finance employees. You want to talk about, maybe it is just the corporate team, but really think through who are the people you're talking to. And from a frontline perspective, if you have different mills, or if you have different construction sites or different hospitals within your system, you don't want to just say nurses. You don't just want to say, construction workers. You really want to think through, are there different groups within your front line that need different types of communication because they're doing different types of jobs? And so that's the first step, is really thinking through, who are all of the people who are being affected by this message that we need to send. The next one is characteristics. Describe the traits that define each group, each stakeholder group, and that will help you tailor those communications. So things like, what is the average tenure of this group? How are they union employees? Are they skeptical of information that comes from the corporate team? Anything that really about those groups that helps you write the messages and make sure that you're picking the right tools. And I like to involve, if I'm working on a project, I like to involve the project team on these conversations, because then it helps them form out their project. It really shows the value that you bring as a communications professional by being able to say, we know all of these things about this group. Desired behaviors. What do you want them to think, feel, or do in order to make the change or the project or whatever you're communicating a success? And so it's basically characteristics, current state, desired behavior is future state. I like to give them a status, a red, yellow, green, just, how much effort do we need to put into communicating with them? If they are already on board, we need to give them the basic information. If they are red, if we know that they are going to be resistant to whatever we're asking them to do, then we might need to put a little more effort in. So giving each stakeholder group a status really helps you figure out where to allocate your effort most. And then communication needs, that's just any notes that you need to help you best identify how to communicate with these groups. And so you can tailor, how often do they need to be communicated? What channels do they prefer? Who do they trust? And so, just again, helping you think through before you start creating the documents or the messages, how you need to form them for each of the stakeholder groups in order for those messages to be successful.
Wonderful. The next template in our stack is the channel definition template. So I love the channel definition template. I think this does a few great things for any organization, but in particular for Frontline. What you can do, and you can do this today to start uncovering some gaps, but I like to sit inside your organization and define all of the channels that you're currently using in your internal communication. So I've given some examples here. List your channel, right? What it is, what the purpose of it is, who's using it, and the expectations associated with this channel, as well as what it's not for. I think that piece is really critical as well. When you do this, I find a few things happen. One, you might find that you don't know the purpose of all of your internal communications channels, right? So this really opens the opportunity to spend some time with leaders, spend some time with the communications team and say, what are we using this channel for? What do we want to be using this channel for? And really ensuring that you're defining that as well as the messaging that gets pushed through that channel accordingly. When you create this list, you might see that you have a lot of digital channels, and you might not have enough that are reaching your frontline, right? So if you put this channel definition template together and you don't see enough ways to reach your frontline, you can go back to leaders and say, look, we've invested in all of these channels. These are the ones that are reaching our corporate staff, but what are we doing to really support our frontline workers? And can we increase budget or focus on how we might incorporate new channels into our mix to better support those groups? And then finally, what I love about this template is that once you create it and you establish your channels and define them, either you or your HR team or whoever is helping support employee onboarding, maybe it's frontline managers at the on-site level, they can share this with new hires when they start. A lot of times we make assumptions. Frontline workers aren't reading this. They don't care about this message. They're not doing anything with it. Well, did we properly set expectations around our channels and how we use them, right? It can be a really, really great tool to establish the foundation of your internal communications the moment somebody starts with your organization, and can make a huge difference. All
right. And I've shared this before in another Speak App webinar, but it's such good information. I wanted to share it again. Talking about a pulse audit, as a communications professional, we should constantly be looking at the work that we're doing. Is it doing the thing that we want it to do? Is for each channel, are we getting the results that we want? And by consistently doing these pulse audit actions, you can have a great feel for how things are working. You can pivot quicker. You can add new things, remove things that aren't working. And so, these are just some things, again, you can do this today. You can start doing these things, and you can add these into your normal routines to make sure that you're constantly reviewing and knowing how things are working. And so the first one is just reviewing the numbers. We have so many analytics now at our fingertips. And so you can see, are people opening the emails? Are people logging into the company intranet? Are the click-through rates good? Are your safety statistics good? If you see a weird shift in safety information, we're having more injuries, there's often a communication challenge that is causing those safety issues. And so, just keeping an eye on those numbers, creating dashboards to help you keep track of trends is a great way to, measure the value of your work, and also share that with leadership so they know how communication is impacting the organization. Asking your audience. This is such a simple thing, but we often forget to do it because we're so busy. You can do pulse surveys. You can hold listening sessions. When you're asking frontline employees to participate in this type of pulse survey or listening session, you can use kiosks and QR codes to make it easy for them to respond. You can also attend stand-ups to gather feedback. Sometimes it's just fun to drop in and have a conversation. You don't want it to feel like you are monitoring them. You don't want them to feel like they're being watched, but go in, ask questions, try to understand. If you come in from a very authentic point of view, people will not be as skeptical about sharing information with you. Connecting with leadership, I encourage people to try to meet with senior leaders, at least once a quarter. more than that if they have the time, but it's really an opportunity to ask them what's working well and what could be improved. And also using that time to ask them how they're empowering and training frontline supervisors to help them become better communicators. So having that open line of communication between your leaders and making sure that you're continuously asking them for feedback is a great way to make sure that the communications that you're providing are working. Field shadowing, so observing real-time communications on the floor, and sometimes you probably need to go to the third shift. We don't like staying up all night, but if you have a group of employees that are doing that, we need to understand what that's like and be able to see the flow of communication throughout the organization. So 3 more on the pulse audit: doing a mini materials review, conducting a quick review of recent messages. So going back through the things that you've sent out in the last 3 months and just understanding what are the key messages that I'm seeing in those communication? Is it consistent across all of our messages? Is it all making sense? Is it cohesive in everything that we're communicating so that employees are getting a story rather than individual messages that might be confusing and conflicting with each other? And just make sure when you're doing this, you're including all of your digital signage, maybe shift notes from, the different shifts and anything that you've printed and posted in common areas. So you're reviewing the full picture of your communications. Map your content. So using Alyssa's template to identify all of your channels, you can take that information and kind of do the true crime red line, put your pin board up and see who is receiving the information from different channels. And it helps you identify, are we reaching everybody? And then also, is there something that we're doing that really no longer serves a purpose? And so just every once in a while going through and saying, here's why this content channel is important and how it's helping the company. And sometimes you can decide, we're spending too much time on this information and we don't need to do this thing anymore. And that's where weigh the cost comes in, looking at the time and resources that's required to produce something against the impact that it has on the organization. And could you be spending time on something else? I've worked with organizations that do a weekly newsletter and it takes their internal comms team 10 hours a week to produce that weekly newsletter. And after doing a review of it, they realize, 25% of the company is actually opening that message and reading it. And so could that time be spent elsewhere? Could that information go in a different channel where people are actually accessing it? And so just kind of understanding, how is information flowing? Is it worth the time that we're spending on it? And is it having the impact that we need it to have on the organization?
Lynn, I love the idea of mapping your content true crime fashion. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while.
I've got an empty wall. I'm planning on doing it.
All right. And then the 4th template, this is a meaty one. I won't go into too much detail here. We've laid it out in a lot of detail in the template packet. So it's got a lot of instruction that is very helpful. And find me on LinkedIn if you need help. Send me a DM. I'm happy to chat more about this. But the manager toolkit and FAQs guide is really that layer where communicators can help equip those frontline managers, those on-site leads, those informal relationships where trust is already built, and give those people information that comes from the top of the organization, but is translated for those frontline workers. So it's really about defining, what's happening. If we're talking about a change or just a general announcement, sharing what that is, and really framing the context around why it matters to the frontline team, right? So in the template, you'll see the first section is what you see here, what's happening, why it matters to the frontline team, what you expect from managers. So again, this is where we can really up-level them and help them, one, shine as managers, but two, use them as carriers of information in ways that make sense for your frontline workers. So, asking them to run team meetings, really sitting with those frontline workers at appropriate times, before or after shift to deliver these messages, things like that. With this, I also included a key activities and deadlines table. So, also communicating to those frontline leaders, here's what's going to happen and when, so they feel in the loop with some of those announcements and changes. Communicating to managers in advance about what's coming to ensure that those frontline leaders feel equipped to share information with their teams. So this is included in the manager toolkit template. And then there are a few more sections that you'll see when you open this template. So we've got an employee Q&A section. So you can prepare talking points to help guide manager conversations and make sure that we're getting frontline specific employee questions answered. I've included some examples of questions in the template to consider. So things around shifts, safety, really specific to the nature of frontline work. And then just a reminder to encourage managers to speak naturally rather than using scripted language to make sure that conversations carry naturally and don't feel forced or pushed just from headquarters. We've also got a section for an escalation process for unanswered questions. So Lynn mentioned earlier, sometimes managers they don't know where to go or where to turn to get questions answered, to find additional information about what's being communicated. So clearly outlining that process and sharing it in advance, and as well as clarifying whether the process is for managers to submit unanswered questions, for frontline staff, or for both, is super helpful for ensuring that some of those loops get closed and questions don't go unanswered. And then finally, as always, a section for supporting resources and materials. So you can include quick links, QR codes, and other helpful information. And then one thing about creating manager toolkits and FAQs, this can be a lot of information and it often sits well on a computer, but thinking about how you might share that information with your frontline leaders and managers if they don't have frequent computer access. So what other methods can you use here? Do you need to deliver packets of information to them so they're able to carry physical copies? Is it helpful to prepare them with the QR code so they can scan and always find the most updated version? Things like that.
All right, so we've talked a lot today about different ways to communicate with your frontline employees, and hopefully you've heard something that you can try today. And so we just wanted to reiterate our 3 big takeaways from the presentation. And it, really strategy, number 1, strategy starts with how work actually happens, and it's not how comms teams work. We need to make sure that we're thinking about the people we're communicating to and how they do their work and how they receive their information in order to successfully communicate with them.
Understanding frontline staff helps us communicate better with them. So again, going back to using a little bit of psychology, getting to know them, spending time with them, understanding their behaviors and what motivates them. Those are the things that we need to do to really get on the ground and understand how best to communicate and make sure that they're getting the messages that they need.
And then your frontline employees have needs and opinions. They want to be included. They want to understand what's happening with the company, and they have opinions. They have ideas they want to share. And so getting to know them will make you a better communicator, and you will be able to communicate more effectively with those groups, and help them feel more included as a part of the company.
You don't have to overhaul your comms overnight. Actually, I don't think Lynn or I would suggest doing that, so don't do that. But hopefully we have shared some ideas, tips, and templates that you can use to start doing something differently today. So our question we wanted to leave you with is, what are you going to start doing today? What template are you most excited about? What are you going to try? You know, if something really resonated with you, I'd love to hear it. I'm sure Lynn would love to hear it. So send us a message on LinkedIn or reach out and let us know. Let us know what you loved, what you're going to try, and what really excited you about this.
Yeah, we'd love to have you post on LinkedIn about this presentation and tag us and share what you learned, what you think you're going to start doing today. And you can connect with us using the QR codes here, or just search for our names in LinkedIn. But both of us love to connect on LinkedIn, and we're really active, and we both share a lot of information about what we know as communications professionals, and would love to be connected with you. I know, unfortunately, we can't do a live Q&A like we had hoped, but I know we had one question of somebody who was talking about how do you handle a survey resistant organization? And I'll start with just a few things that I've learned, because almost every organization seems to be survey resistant. There's this idea that we survey too much, and some companies do, but I feel like if you can show that that when you survey, the results are being used and you're sharing them with the company, I feel like people love being asked for their opinion. And so when you give people a chance to share what they think and how they think things could be better, they want to take that opportunity. And so, but we need to, when we do survey, we need to be able to say, you know, here's what we learned from the survey. Here are the things that we're going to change. Because if you're just surveying to survey and you're not sharing the results, it's not worth surveying. And that's when you do start getting that survey fatigue. But if people feel like their opinions are being heard and they matter, then you don't have that type of fatigue and resistance. And so just showing that the surveys really do make a difference, I think helps sell the idea of doing those surveys with leadership.
And if it's not a formal, 10, 15, 20 question survey that you're sending out, maybe it's more of listening groups, focus groups, listening tours, getting out to all of the different shifts, as Lynn mentioned, some of the more conversations that we might think are a little bit more informal, but can actually teach us a lot just from getting on the ground with them. And then ensuring that, of course, you're collecting data there and can bring that back to supplement any more traditional survey data, if you will.
Yes.
Amazing. Thank you both for joining today and sharing all this great information. Lynn, Alyssa, you're the best. Thank you for your time and expertise, and for your willingness to reach out and chat with people. We really appreciate that. So again, Speak App is an expert in frontline experience, and we really care about this space and reaching those folks who are doing the work that needs to get done. And I think that you've shared some amazing insights in how to reach them and better enable them within the company. So thank you, and thanks to everybody who was able to join today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you, Speak App.